Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Kwame Graves-Okokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're not going to be asking a question, but we are going to be looking at a draft constitution for an independent England, right? Now, you might be like, well, what the hell is this, right? And that's because basically something I've been very interested in for a very, very long time since I first started to learn about politics is why does England not have its own constitution? Yeah. And when I say England within this, I don't just mean the UK. I mean, it's really mad enough that we're one of only two countries in the world which don't have a codified, written down constitution. But I mean specifically England, right? And I'm going to make the case here for independent England, as I have in many of my other videos as well. So within this, I want you to, in the comment sections, the bonus question for this video is basically, what changes would you make to what I've suggested here, right? So it's not just a thing of like, I don't want people just to be like, oh, I disagree with that, right? I want you to come up with alternative proposals for whatever it is, right? So if I say I'm going to talk about this specific topic and you disagree with that, I want you to tell me what is you disagree about it with, right? And then I want you to then lay out what you would say in like, as an alternative, right? So that's kind of what this is. I want this to be a collaborative kind of a project, yeah, but at the same time, I bear in mind what James Madison said in the Federalist paper number 38, which is that if you look at the great constitutions of the world, they've nearly always been written by one lawmaker, right? And then other people have chimed in and basically made adjustments, etc., etc. And in general, I'm not saying that I'm the person to do that, but in general, whoever it is, it should be one person writing it and then a small group of people commenting on it, etc., etc. Because what you don't want is, if you have a huge constitutional convention, right, where every Tom, Dick and Harry writes little bits here and changes little bits there, etc., etc., when it becomes too big of a collaborative project, what you end up with is like constitutions which are just far, far too long, which are just far too like difficult for the people to decipher. Because the thing is, what a constitution is, a good constitution, is one which protects the liberties of the people. And the way it does that is by saying to the government what it can and cannot do. So constitutions in dictatorships, right, they will say the people have the right to this, the people have the right to that, etc., etc. But it never says clearly how the government will be kept in check, right? It never says like, this is what the government cannot do. And so a good constitution is something which you look at and go, right, this is something which clearly says this is what the government can and cannot do, right? So that's something to kind of bear in mind. So if you look at like a constitution like the United States one, right, that constitution there has 4,546 words, right? If you look at the EU constitution, it has over 60,000 words in the English version, right? So that's what happens when you're having this huge kind of committee with everyone coming together and trying to write for it. It ends up just becoming very, very long, and it becomes very difficult for the citizenry to be able to hold like the people in power to account, because somewhere within that is meant to be where their rights are buried, right? Now, a big argument for people saying there shouldn't be a codified written constitution for the United Kingdom or for England or for any, what they will say is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And to me, I've always really hated this. Yeah, this is basically the complete opposite of Enlightenment thinking, right? This kind of just goes, everything's fine, just leave it as it is, right? Now, just because it has in some ways worked, right? So our constitution, although it's not codified, although it's not written down explicitly into one big document, yeah, you can argue that since the time of Magna Carta, there have been constitutional kind of like bills and stuff, yeah. So Magna Carta, you've had like the Bill of Rights in 1689. You've had other different acts of Parliament which have kind of added to the UK Constitution. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult for you as a citizen of a UK to kind of say, this is what my rights are, this is where the government is kept in control. So we've been very lucky that we just happen to, because of the general culture that we have, etc., etc., we've always been lucky that we've been able to just kind of mill through basically, and just kind of like be lucky in the fact that we never had a kind of a dictatorial kind of government, right? But if ever we did, then it's not very clear who is control of what and who can do what, right? It's kind of if you can get a majority in Parliament to agree on something, then it can just be like put through and stuff. And if you can get through the House of Lords, it can be put through. And the Queen or whoever the sitting monarch is, unless they want to really go over the top, they have no way of of striking down that law. And we the people, we have no real say except at an election time, at a time at which the Parliament themselves decide whether there's going to be an election. So there's not really much recourse, for if you have a tyrannical government, it's very, very difficult for any kind of real checks and balances on it. So we've been lucky thus far, but it's not to say that our luck at some point won't run out. And therefore, it's better to have something written down in stone and saying this is what can be done, this is what can't be done. So that's kind of the overarching thing of why I'm kind of like writing this, right? Now, the other part of this with regard to independent England, right? Now, as I've said in many of my other videos, right, the United Kingdom is inevitably going to split away, right? You can see Scottish nationalism, you can see calls for Irish unity and stuff, you can see the rise of Plaid Cymru, and you can also see the beginnings of a kind of reawakening of English nationalism, right? So without a single politician ever making the case, without even people like Nigel Farage and stuff, right? Nearly all of the politicians that you see on the TV are unionists, right? There's almost no one I can think of, who's in like the realm of politics who makes the case for an independent England. Maybe for an English Parliament, which obviously the overwhelming majority of English people want, but for an independent England, which, looking at some polls, you can see a majority of people even now are in favour of. So without any kind of mass movement, without much TV coverage, etc., there's a quiet kind of bubbling, there's a quiet undercurrent, of English people who want there to be an independent England. We're tired of this idea of of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, whatever that is, right? It's gone past its sell-by date. The mythology that surrounded it is tied up with empire, and it's tied up with all these kind of things, which actually were massive distraction and somewhere within all of that, English like nationalism and self-identity got kind of shrouded in like this idea. And actually, more recently, I've just finished reading the shortest history of England. Definitely read this. There's other books as well, but this is a very good and concise book. But it's like, so kind of gets one thinking about actually England has its own history, it has its own legacy and stuff, right? And there's also many problems within English nationalism, right? This idea of basically maintaining the UK actually makes it more difficult for England, to have a unified sense of itself, because in the UK, what ends up happening is all power and all the money is centered in London, right? So what this does is it alienates people who are outside of it, right? So first of all, obviously, if you're Scottish or Welsh or Northern Irish, you feel like very alienated from it. But even people in the north of England do not feel a connection with London. And even people who are within like the southeast of the country, right? Even those who live outside of London, they also feel disconnected. So both urban and rural, northern and southern, ordinary English people feel completely disenfranchised, right? And even for me, who right now, I live one bus ride away from Westminster, but as I've said before, it may as well be in Australia because it doesn't feel like it represents us, the people, right? It doesn't speak to us. The elite who are there in Westminster, they run things based on how they've always run things, right? And so that they have no real interest in that, right? They have always been imperialist minded, they've always been expansionist, right? They've always kind of looked at expanding their own power around the world. And so that's why they don't want English nationalism, because it would reduce their own power. But the fact is that, having all this power centered in London is not good for Londoners, and it's also not good for the rest of the country, which is also something we'll get onto with regard to this, with regard to where the capital for this new England ought to be. We'll talk about that in great detail a bit later. And also something to note is that within living memory, we saw this when we had Brexit, right? At time of crisis, who has power, right? Like the referendum itself was handed to the people by Parliament. there was no call for, if you wanted to have a second referendum at any point, it ended up being a huge kind of debate about whether there would be one, because like people, there's no mechanism, like if there's a referendum now, then there's no mechanism to say, oh, there's going to be a referendum in this many years, don't worry about it, whatever it is, right? So many things kind of like up in the air, right? Even simple things such as like, we are the United Kingdom, right? We have a monarchy, but many people in the country don't know whether the monarchy will last for the next 100 years. So if you're writing a constitution, a fundamental thing with a constitution is twofold, yeah? First of all, it has to be something which is aimed to last, right? It has to be something which looks throughout all of history and then takes into consideration all those things and then projects that and looks into the future and thinks, what things from the present can we look at and think, right, what direction is history going to head in, right? What issues could there be in 300 years time which people will still look back on and go, this constitution speaks to that, right? So it's something which has to be very, very broad, right? It's not like a party manifesto. It has to be something which, lots of people might be like, oh, well, you should have this exact policy here, and it's like, no, well, if it's a party manifesto, it speaks to the different ideologies of that party. But if it's a constitution, it has to be something which has not just a majority of support in the here and now, it has to have a super majority of support both here and for the next like 200 to 300 years, right? So it has to be something which we can all kind of agree on and stuff, right? And that's kind of something to really kind of bear in mind with this, that what the constitution has to lay out is, in the event of public opinion changing, right, that you look at this document and go, this is still in keeping with the times, right? It still has to be broad enough that it still speaks to people, no matter how much culture changes, no matter how much the country changes. And that's something which is a very, very difficult task. I'm not saying with this that, this should just be seen as gospel, right? I'm not even saying that this should necessarily be like the only kind of constitution which is kind of like put forward, because obviously everyone's got all different ideas. But hopefully with this conversation here, it begins to lay the groundwork for something which, like I've said, I want this to be my life's work and stuff, right? Yes, I'm just a lowly YouTuber at the moment, but I do have desires to move beyond that in later life and stuff. And this is one of those things which is like, I want this to be my life's work. So I hope that you'll join me along with this journey here. It might go on for quite some time. I will try to keep it to a manageable thing. I was going to have some of my friends join in on this as well. Maybe at a later date they might be able to. They just happen to be quite busy this week. So we weren't able to get them on the call and stuff. But yeah, so let me know in the comment section what you think of this as we're kind of going through. So in the last video, when we spoke about the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, that was a massive influence with regard to, like the ideas that I had for this, but also looking at the US Constitution and like just the history of that, because, America has lasted now for almost 250 years, and what the framers wanted, right, and what ended up actually happening in some regards is completely kind of different, right? So that's kind of something to kind of bear in mind as well. Like, for instance, the Supreme Court, right, didn't necessarily have the power that the framers initially wanted it to be. The role of the presidency, does that necessarily have the role that the framers intended it to be? Probably not, right? So in that regard there, you also have to kind of bear in mind, okay, taking the lessons from these things here, how do we apply this into this constitution? And like I said, we're aiming for this to be lasting like 200 years, 300 years, etc. The average life expectancy for a constitution, 19 years, right? So since 1789, the average constitution around the world has only lasted for 19 years. I don't want for this constitution, or for any constitution for this country, to last for a shorter amount of time than I am right now, right? So I'm 28, I want it to last way, way longer than that. So I hope that you join me for this journey, and yeah, let's crack on. Right, so the first part of this, if I've done this correctly, is going to be having this on screen, right? So you'll be able to see as I go through. So, the title is, an English constitution, and we have the preamble, right? So the preamble is obviously the bit at the very beginning of a constitution, or just a document in general. So it's a quote, which is from Thomas Rainsborough, and I've modernized the quote because it's from 1647, right? Now, I've not modernized it in the sense of some of the kind of more archaic language. What I've changed has been, instead of it saying like he and man, etc., etc., because obviously it's very kind of dated in that sense, yeah, right? What I have done is made these things gender neutral, because I think one of the things that you see like with like the US Constitution, for instance, right, is, for instance, when it talks about the role of the president, in no part does it ever allude to the idea of it could eventually be a woman. So all the things say he will do this, he should do this, etc., etc. So trying with this constitution now, yeah, to kind of think about, if already in society we're talking about like having gender neutral kind of like language and stuff, right? In 100 years time, 200 years time, 300 years time, it's probably going to be even more than this. So if it's kind of saying he, like man, 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 it's going to be quite archaic already, right? So that's something to kind of like bear in mind when we kind of are going through the quote, right? But Thomas Rainsborough, he was a leveller. So this was during the English Civil War periods. So you had Parliament versus the King's forces, and within the parliamentarians, right, led by Cromwell, you also had many of the ordinary soldiers who were going, okay, right, so the King's on this side and Parliament's on the other side, but we, the people, who, don't forget, ordinary people would have no say on like what MPs were elected to Parliament anyway. Yeah, so it was like, well, if we're going to have this huge fight about the power of the king, let's also have this fight about, what the role of the parliament is going to be, how the parliament is going to be more representative of our people, right? So already within this year, you can see like kind of like early calls for like a democratic like England, yeah, which speaks to all of its people. So the quote here now is this: I think that the poorest they that are in England have a life to live as the greatest day. And therefore, truly, I think it's clear that everyone that is to live under a government ought first by their own consent to put themselves under the government. And I do not think that the poorest person in England is bound in a strict sense to that government that they have not had a voice to put themselves under. So within that, you can see like kind of like basically what this thing is all talking about. It's basically saying that government has to be by the consent of the governed. It has to be from the people. And if the people do not have a say in what that government is, then they are not strictly bound by it. Now, that's not to say that, obviously, like, it's not to say that if you don't vote for this party, therefore you get to just like rebel and stuff. Yeah, no, that's not what it's saying at all. What it is saying is that everyone, regardless of class, regardless of whatever, right, ought to have a say in the government which they live under. And if they don't, then there's a fundamental problem with that. So this whole document here, which you're going to be going through, it's this the constant theme is going to be one of making government accountable to the people, yeah, rather than just like the government being accountable to itself, which is how many constitutions end up being framed. The next part is talking about monarchy, right? So this is something which I've kind of was talked about earlier. So this is the thing of, so the monarch is the head of state and commander-in-chief, right? But may only be chosen from the House of Windsor by the people. So within this, like kind of, it's this idea of a so-called popular monarchy. So the monarch that we have at the moment, right, comes from a long line which like dates all the way back to the days of William the Conqueror, right? And the thing is, with regard to that, is a thing of, the king and queen, obviously, the current queen, Queen Elizabeth, like is very widely supported by many of the people. However, her son, Prince Charles, at the moment, this being filmed in 2022, he's not the most popular person, right? And so one can probably expect that after the Queen dies, right, that republicanism will probably rise in England as well, right? Not probably to the extent where we won't having a republic, right? But because like a lot of people like Prince William, who's likely to take on the throne afterwards. But the thing is, it's one of those things where it's like, actually, the monarchy is, it does what it does best when it has the public consent, right? When it has the support of the people. And so this kind of just makes it more accountable. Now, we don't want every Tom, Dick and Harry like being able to like become like to become like the next king or queen and stuff, right? So that's why it says within the House of Windsor. But for instance, rather than it just being this automatic thing where it's like, the eldest son or whatever ends up taking over, right? Or actually, no, they have changed more recently. So it's the eldest child. But in the future, it might be a situation where people want to skip, right? So if people have the choice, opinion polls are kind of saying that they'd rather skip a generation, right? So instead of having, Prince Charles taken over after Queen Elizabeth, people would want to skip straight to having King William, right? So it's basically pushing for the idea that if we are to have a monarchy, it ought to be one which is a popular monarchy, decided by the people. And we've also laid out the thing here where it says, look, the monarchy itself can be abolished by the people if ever they so choose, with the role of head of state and commander-in-chief going to the president instead. So we're going to talk a bit about the president later on and stuff. Yeah, don't worry, we'll still have a prime minister, but yeah, we'll talk about the president a bit later on. But it's again this idea of if the people of the country decide that there ought to be a republic, it ought to be their choice, right? At the moment, if a majority of people wanted there to be a republic, there's no clear constitutional roadmap for what would happen, right? Like kind of if Parliament decided, okay, fine, we're trying to have a republic, then it might happen. But the thing is, you can't be guaranteed that just because, time and time again, the majority of people want something, right? And Parliament wants the complete opposite. And so what ends up happening is whatever Parliament wants rather than what the people want. So that's something to kind of really bear in mind with this, right? And also we're going to lay out the thing here of the kind of obvious thing, which is that the monarch is a figurative role with real power aligned with the prime minister. So that's in keeping with the system that we have at the moment. Over the last a few hundred years, the power of the monarchy has become more of a symbolic role. So this was just kind of just saying clearly it's a symbolic role, it's a figurative role. So the real power lies with the prime minister. Obviously, you still have the thing where the prime minister has to go and consult the queen or the king or whoever it would be. But it still is a thing where ultimately the monarch is just a figurehead, and the real power lies with the actual kind of executive, right? For the next bit now, we're going to talk about the judiciary, right? So the judiciary, so we're going to have the Supreme Court consisting of 9 judges, and they are to be elected by the people. So this is a big problem with the US Supreme Court, right? Is that it's appointed by the president and then it's voted for by the Senate, right? But the people have no say on who the Supreme Court justices will be. And seeing as they have the power to basically create new laws here, like when they strike things down as unconstitutional, right? They can read things into the Constitution at any part and go, right, we have, people have a right to do that. People have, regardless of what the founders wanted, regardless of what anyone who kind of had any say in the Constitution wanted, people read something into that was never really there. And so it's basically a rule by lawyers. Yeah, no one voted for them, they just were appointed there. However, in I believe 37 out of the 50 states, the judiciary there, from the judges all the way up to the kind of state courts, are elected by the people, right? So this makes them more accountable. So that way, if you have a decision, such as Roe v. Wade, such as whatever other a Supreme Court case, which is kind of contentious, you can think of, if people make those kind of decisions, it's a thing where they're still held accountable by the people, right? So they can make what decision they want. At the end of the day, they're going to be held accountable. And the thing is as well, when we talk about this, right? So, and it is only through this authority that they acquire the right to strike down laws as being unconstitutional, whether said laws are made by parliamentary votes or by popular referenda. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later and stuff, But it's a thing where, the Supreme Court having the power to strike down a law as unconstitutional, it only comes from the fact of they've been elected by the people. And so if Parliament decides that they want to pass a law, if even the people decide through referenda, we'll talk about the power of the people later, right? But even if even if there's a referendum and stuff, right, and it violates human rights, it will get struck down. If if Parliament passes something which violates human rights or is unconstitutional, it gets struck down, right? So that's kind of something to really kind of bear in mind. That within this, we're kind of saying that yes, the Supreme Court has the power to strike things down as unconstitutional, but it's only within this mechanism that they have the right to do so, right? The next thing we're going to talk about in terms of the elections for the judges, right? So the judges, we're saying that once every 6 years, they ought to be elected, right? But that there's no term limits with regard to judges. So whereas some of the other officers here, we will talk about term limits. We're going to get onto that a bit later. But with regard to this, we're basically saying that what you want is a judiciary which is there for the long run, right? Unless they make a really, really bad decision where the people go, no, like get rid of this person, right? You want it to be a thing where for the most part, they're there for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, however long that they're there for, right? Because with the kind of consistency through like the passed down wisdom through the ages and stuff, yeah, you want the law to, you don't want it to constantly be changing. You don't want it to kind of be going up and down with the whims of like public opinion, right? And so that's why it says, look, to retain as much continuity within the interpretation of the law as is desirable by the people, while still retaining accountability for their rulings. So this is basically the case for how the judiciary should be set up. Also, as well, something to kind of note with the constitution I've kind of laid out here is that there's elements to which, like, the old constitution, which we have, constitution, there's many unwritten parts in it, right? So I didn't want to write down every single nook and cranny of that. People at a later point, if they decide that they want to add on those little things, they can. But a lot of the tradition that we have is still this thing of like certain things being unwritten, as just unwritten conventions. And so by and large, let's try and keep that as much as possible. Yeah, don't have to write down every single little thing. Yeah, right. For now, this is just the basic building blocks, and people feel that the need to kind of add things on later, then they can. But that's just kind of like, yeah. So I'm not talking about. That's why it's only 2 bullet points here for the whole judiciary, and only like 2 bullet points whatever for the monarchy. It's not supposed to be some exhaustive thing about every single responsibility and every single thing that each of these things do and stuff, right? So just bear that in mind. Now we're going to talk about the legislature, right? So this is where we're going to get quite interested, right? So Parliament is sovereign via the power instilled in it by the people. So this is a big thing. This kind of settles once and for all this kind of argument about, is Parliament there along like the kind of Burkean model, whereby, you vote for the MPs make the judgment themselves, and then that's just it, and if the people really don't like it, they can vote them out in the next election. But this is kind of saying, actually, no, it's a reminder that yes, Parliament can act like within like how it wants, but at the same time, it also has to bear in mind that the people are the ones who are sovereign, right? So yes, Parliament is sovereign, but it's only sovereign because the people have instilled that within it. And if the people ever decide that they don't want that Parliament to be there, it has no legitimacy, it has no right to exist, right? So that's kind of a very fundamental thing. This is something which you see within the Declaration of Independence, where it's talking about like, people have the right to kind of like overthrow a government and to install a new one if you so feel like, right? Because if the government is not holding up their God-given rights of like life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as well as their many other liberties, then it's a thing where what is even the point of that government? So anyway, that was quite a long kind of rant, but a lot of this will be. So, however, Parliament has a duty to uphold the Constitution by solemn oath, and if ever a referendum is held in any part of the country that seeks to deny the rights of a part of the people, it is Parliament's responsibility to strike it down. So this is the thing, right? So even if, right, the people decide that they want something, whether it's in referendums, whether just public pressure or whatever it is, right? Even if they do that, it still is the Parliament's responsibility to strike down the law. So obviously you've got the Supreme Court, which can strike it down, but you've also got Parliament, where they go, right, this is unacceptable, it's getting struck down, it's not happening, forget about it, right? And yes, at election time, the people can hold them accountable, but at the same time, it's a thing where, they still have a duty to uphold the Constitution. They still have a duty to uphold human rights. And so even if a majority of the people say you should do this thing, right, doesn't mean that the MP should just blindly go along with it. Yes, for other things which don't have anything to do with human rights or the Constitution, cool, whatever, don't stand in the way of that. But if it kind of violates these fundamental things, then the Parliament has a duty to uphold these values, right? Now, the next bit is talking about elections, right? So in this country, at the moment, it's kind of all up in the air. Like, yes, you do have the kind of thing where it's like once every 5 years. However, 5 years is quite a long time. If you look at opinion polls, people kind of prefer like 4 years. So for Parliament, when it's talking about like House of Commons, right, it should be a thing where it's once every 4 years. And then when it comes to the Senate, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, the Senate should be once every 6 years, right? Because like that, the Senate, will be a bit more of a kind of senior role. So just like in America, where like senators like last for 6 years, that's kind of why. I don't want it to be a thing where in America, when you have like the House of Representatives, it's once every 2 years. That's proven over time to be far too rapid. And also with regard to like the Senate, whereby a third of the Senate is kind of elected like every 2 years. That's just too much. Yeah, what that ends up creating is a kind of lobbying class, a permanent lobbying class in Washington D.C., where there's just constantly like basically campaigning becomes a business. Yeah, you want it to be something which is like once every now and again, right? You don't want it to be a thing where like you're always campaigning. That's just that ends up meaning that decisions can never really be made, and that no real change that's actually fundamental can actually kind of like be made, because they're constantly thinking, oh, I need to get elected again, I need to get elected again. So we don't want that. You want some stability with things, you want some accountability with things, and it has to be that kind of balance between the two, right? So talking now about term limits, yeah. So we're in this talking about so MPs will serve for a maximum of 24 consecutive years and must wait for an entire election cycle before being able to stand for another election, right? So the thing about it being 24 consecutive years, yeah, because I was thinking about in history, I was like, okay, if you have a term limit and it's like, okay, a maximum of 30 years, a maximum of 40 years, what ends up happening if you have someone like Winston Churchill, for instance, who's in for a very, very long time, and realistically, so he first got elected to Parliament in 1900, and he became Prime Minister in 1940. Yes, there were some years where he wasn't in Parliament, but at the same time, if you have like a hard and fast rule, which has like a really strict like term limit, then you end up missing out on some people who can be very, very decisive. However, it's this kind of balance between it's basically saying, okay, if someone's good enough, yeah, they'll be in Parliament for 24 years. They can take a break, they can take like a 4 year gap. And if they are really, really wanted by the people, yeah, then the people will choose them again, right? So because what you end up having otherwise is you end up having a system where by like the incumbent, it just gets elected and elected. So that's how you end up having like people in Parliament for like 50 years, right? Or like in the Congress for like 50 years. And you're like, well, in all this time, what have you really done? You just kind of sat there, you've kind of like collected a big paycheck and stuff. But it's a thing of, for all the good that you could have done, like you should have done it by now, right? Yeah, in the name of God, go, right? To kind of like paraphrase that quote, right? So that's kind of what this kind of is, yeah. So as I say here in brackets, yeah, to limit careerism whilst also ensuring that statespeople will be retained and have the chance to return if they are deemed popular enough by the electorate, right? So I've used the term statespeople as opposed to statesmen because obviously trying to be more inclusive and stuff, right? But the thing is, that's something which we kind of want to aim towards. We don't want just kind of typical politicians who just want to get re-elected. We want the creation of like statespeople, right? You want people who like they get into politics because it's a duty. They're not just trying to enrich themselves, yeah, right? They're trying to actually govern the country in such a way that the country will become better, yeah, rather than just they themselves as the slimy politicians, rather than just them becoming better, right? So that's kind of so that kind of covers a lot of the things with regard to like the House of Commons, right? Now talking about the Senate, right? So this would be replacing the House of Lords that we currently have with a Senate, right? So the Senate will be made up of candidates from the two largest parties within each county, and the senators themselves shall be elected from the local councillors from each of the counties, with respect to their own respective parties. Now, this might seem quite cryptic and stuff, yeah, and this is quite a kind of new thing. But the thing is, what I want to kind of like lay out is this, yeah, right? So first of all, well, we're going to talk about like counties like a little bit later and stuff in terms of the power of the counties. But it's a thing where if you look at like the US system, where when it talks about like senators, right? You've got the 50 states, you've got like two senators, so you've got like 100 senators, yeah, across like the United States. But the thing is, in some of these states, you have two Republican senators. In other states, you have two Democratic senators, etc., etc. Now, that there's problems with that, yeah, because it means that like first of all, smaller parties have like almost no chance. I mean, a lot of the things with the US system, like they've got no chance as well. And also as well within this, also I'm pushing for proportional representation, yeah, not for any more of this like first past post system. I think it really damages the country. I think it makes things a lot more tribal and makes things, especially if you look at like North versus South, like kind of like it becomes a very entrenched kind of thing, and also it disenfranchises a lot of people and stuff. But yeah, so we want to have proportional representation when we're looking at these things. But it's a thing where if you look at the different counties of England, right, you've got London and other like kind of major cities, yeah, which would just vote, well, in the present time, they would just vote for Labour, right? And then the countryside, it would just be Tory, 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 right? So the thing is, it's like, so if you had a Senate which was just based like in the same way that you have like the US system, right? What you'd more likely not end up having is just it being overly skewed towards the Tory vote, or whichever party kind of dominated the kind of rural counties, yeah, that would be the one that would just have like permanent control over the Senate. Because like the UK in many ways is much less balanced than like the US is. So that's kind of something to kind of like really bear in mind, that like having a system like how the US wouldn't really work in England. And therefore, what I've basically said with this is that it should be the two largest parties within each constituency, within each county, right? So like the party which gets like the most votes in that county, yeah, cool, they have a senator, and then the party which comes second, they also have a senator, right? So we'll talk about this in a little bit, to kind of explain this a little bit more, right? So senators will be limited to serving a maximum of 24 consecutive years, and afterwards must wait for an entire election cycle before being able to run for another election. So that's kind of what we said as well for the House of Commons as well, is this thing of 24 years again. So these two measures for the Senate will protect against careerism and ensure that senators come to the job only for public service and to represent the two most dominant factions within their respective counties, right? Instead of the simple representation of majority rule as seen under other proportional voting systems. So the thing is, that might sound like there's a lot of kind of things to cover there, but bear this in mind, right? First of all, if you have first past the post, right, you can easily have a situation whereby a party which gets maybe a third of the vote can end up taking 100% of the power in that place, right? And that's not something which you really want. And similarly as well, if you have like just like a proportional representation, like kind of under many different systems, right, it represents people, but not in like the necessarily the best way, right? And so this system here that I'm kind of like suggesting can represent people in a better way. And like maybe this is where people kind of have a bit of disagreement. Yeah, maybe they go, actually, no, this would be a better way of doing it. But after thinking about this for a long time, I kind of was like, actually, I think that having this kind of system works better, because say for instance you have the top party, right, which gets 40% of the vote, right, and then the party which comes second gets 30% of the vote. Okay, cool, now you've represented 70% of the people, right? Now, under just a proportional representation system, you couldn't have a thing where it's like, okay, you've got 3 different parties, or you've got 2 parties or whatever, and they add up to 51%, right? Okay, cool. So now you've represented 51% of the people. So yes, you've represented the majority of people, congratulations. But actually half like the constituency is not actually represented. So hopefully something like this, if you take the first party and the second party, then that should represent people more. And actually in some places, if it was like a 2-horse race, yes, if you think about the United States, right? If you have a situation whereby the Republicans get like, 51% and Democrats get 49%, well, now under this system, 100% of the people are represented by their electorates. So if you're a Democrat, you've got a Democratic senator there. If you're a Republican, you've got a Republican senator there, so you can speak to these people. So that's kind of why I was kind of like laying it out in that kind of way. Yeah? But again, as with all these things, let me know what you think about it. Right, the next thing we'll talk about was with regard to ratifications, yeah, for different constitutional amendments, right, and also just for the Constitution itself. So what we've kind of said is this: so the ratifications of amendments require, firstly, a simple majority of the people via referenda, followed by a 3/5 majority in both houses, right? So as we say here, this protects the liberties of the people while also allowing enough flexibility to make amendments without too much rigidity. The thing is, yeah, under the US system, it's a thing where it's the other way around, right? So it's a thing where, how all the amendments have been passed, yeah, is a thing where it's Congress which has passed it, and then the states have to approve. Or there's another way of doing it whereby the states push it through, and then like they're the ones who have to approve. But first of all, the ordinary people don't have a say on like what amendments get added and stuff, right? So this kind of flipping it on its head is basically saying, actually, rather than these politicians coming up with these ideas, let the people themselves come up with these ideas, and then let like a parliament like vote on it and stuff. And I said the thing of 3/5 because, you know, 3/4 is just too high of a thing. It makes amendments far too difficult. If you look at like the US Constitution with different amendments and stuff, a lot of amendments end up just being killed off by this kind of thing, yeah, where you need either, you know, you need like 2/3 of Congress, and then you need like 3/4 of the states. It just makes the whole thing it's too difficult to change. You know, so I think 3/5 in both houses, I think, is a good like kind of compromise, right? If you get 60% of people or more in both houses to agree on something, then, like, you know, it has a broad enough kind of thing of consensus, and also people can like change their minds and stuff, right? So it allows a bit of flexibility. Under the British system which we have currently, if you get a majority of people in like the House of Commons and a majority of people in the House of Lords, that can now become the constitution. So at the moment it's like it's, you know, 50-50, right? And you can get something like passed through, right? Under this system here, you'd need 60%. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to pass amendments, but at the same time, it's not impossible, right? Right, so this next bit here is talking about having a new capital, right? And it's going to be situated in a new town called New Jerusalem, near the village of Cotton in the Elms in Derbyshire. Now, I'll say here, like, the reason for that is the point furthest from the sea, and therefore within England's heartland, yeah, right? So this little town here of Cotton in the Elms, this is actually the furthest point from like the sea of any point within England, right? So every, you know, if you look at London, it's like right by the sea, etc., pretty much. But this bit here is right in England's heartland, and also as well, it also happens to geographically be like quite central as well, yeah, right. So it's within the Midlands, yeah. So it's not too far south, it's not too far north. It's nearish to Birmingham. We didn't want it just to be Birmingham, yeah, because like, yeah, Birmingham has got a lot of the infrastructure for that, but at the same time, it also it's already like a large city and stuff. So we kind of want to build a new capital, a new start, a new beginning, just like how many other countries that around the world have done. Washington DC, for instance, Canberra in Australia, Brasilia in Brazil, etc., etc. So starting a new capital from scratch is kind of like a good like new beginning, right? You know, so having it here also takes away the power from London, right? So that like the rest of the country doesn't feel so alienated. It's not like all the power in the country is just down south, yeah, like that in London. It's now is a thing where it feels a bit more representative of people, and it's also not so far from London, so even people in London and the south will still feel connected to it. If you have the capital in York, or if you have the capital in Manchester, then it will alienate the Southerners, yeah. So then either way, you want it to be somewhere in the middle, right? And also with the name of it, yeah, right, it's the fulfillment of Blake's song Jerusalem. Now, we don't want it to be called Jerusalem because then that would be confused with like the capital of Israel and stuff, yeah. So we didn't want it like that. But what was basically saying is, yeah, New Jerusalem, yeah. And it's because of Blake's song, which is Jerusalem. So where it says like where we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant lands, right? And to also as well talking about like Blake's song Jerusalem, when it talks about dark satanic mills, etc., etc. This place here, you know, this is the industrial heartland, like of like the UK, the former industrial heartland of the UK, kind of thing. So it's again kind of talking about that. It's like we've kind of come to the fruition of like a hope, a desire, yeah, for hundreds of years, yeah. Like actually, we're going to be able to build a new Jerusalem here in England's green and pleasant lands. So it's quite poetic. Some people might think it's a bit too much, but yeah, let me know what you think of that. But I came up with the idea, obviously, but I think that it really speaks to people and stuff, right? Also as well, with regard to this, it's just like laying out. So at the current time, we have 533 MPs and stuff within England. And then if you add this up with the 96 senators and you've got the one president, this adds up to 630 parliamentarians, right, in total, right? So rather than the current system where we have 650 British MPs and then we've got a House of Lords which has like I think something like 800 or something, it's just way too large of a legislature. It's just mad, right? So this scales it down to 630. This means that like it's a lot more accountable. People can actually kind of recognize their politicians and stuff, and it when you have too much representation, there's an argument where people go, oh no, it's better, but at the same time it actually becomes more difficult because you're kind of like, you know, even now I follow politics quite like closely, yeah. There's maybe 150 MPs I could actually point out to you. The rest of them, you know, the other like 500 they're literally just making up the numbers, right? So if you're one of the people who are represented by one of these people, it's kind of like, So anyway, so the next bit here, we're talking about the Senate's role, right? So the role of the Senate is much like the House of Lords currently, right? Which is to scrutinize, and it says there, if necessary, to block legislation, right? Because we don't want to have it as the role of the Senate is to block legislation, because then nothing would ever get passed, right? But saying if necessary, they have the power to block legislation, right? That comes from the Commons. So the House of Commons is the one, like they're the ones who propose the laws. The Senate look over it and go like, okay, is this good for the country? Is this good for the counties and stuff? Yeah. And then from there, if they approve it, then it becomes the law, right? And it says also the role of the Senate is to represent the interests of their own counties, right? So if it's Kent, for instance, or if it's like Derbyshire or whatever it is, right? Like basically the senators there, they are there to represent the interests of their counties, right? And like the county councils, the county governments that they have, they are there to obviously kind of like hold some power and stuff, right? And to have their own responsibilities. So whenever you have the central government trying to impose on them and trying to be like, oh, we want to do this, that, and that, it's like, actually, no, we want to do that, right? So this constitution actually creates a much more devolved England, whereby the regions, and the different county governments have a lot more power than is currently the situation where in the UK at the moment, everything's very centralized within like the central government in Westminster. So we want to kind of disperse that power, disperse the responsibilities a little bit more around the country. Next bit here we want to talk about is the role of the Speaker of the House of Commons. So the Speaker of the House of Commons, much in the same way we have that with the current system, is an impartial MP, and they're elected by the other MPs, right? The Commons reserve the right to censure or impeach the Speaker for impartiality or misconduct, right? So if for whatever reason they want to get rid of the Speaker, it's the role of the MPs to be able to get rid of them if they want, So if they've if they've been seen to be violating their impartiality, or if they've just done some other kind of like misdemeanor in general, then it's a thing where you have the right to kind of get rid of them, right? This bit here where we're talking about the armed forces, right? The deployment of our armed forces must be approved by 3/5 majority in both houses of parliament, unless the country is under imminent attack, in which case the Prime Minister shall decide. Now this is quite a lot to unpack here, but the thing is, with regard to questions of war and peace, I think that the current system whereby it's a 51-49 decision is just ridiculous. The country cannot be going to war if half the country is opposed to it, right? So I think that's why the bar needs to be a little bit higher, right? It needs to be at least kind of 3/5, right? However, if a country's under imminent attack, we ain't got time to have all the MPs sitting around and debating and stuff, right? It needs to be something which is actioned, and it needs to be actioned by the Prime Minister. However, this is the next bit which we're going to talk about. The Prime Minister's decision is to be subject to later parliamentary scrutiny. And if the Prime Minister is decided to have acted disproportionately, they may face censure or removal and their action halted or undone. So for instance, if we look at the classic thing with regard to the Iraq War, right? So first of all, a check on that would have been you would have needed 3/5 of Parliament to have voted for it. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was in our own timeline. I know that many Conservative voters were in favour of it. I know that many Labour people were against it. So I'll look through the figures and hopefully I've got the figures on screen now. But it's a thing where, okay, as soon as we kind of realised that what Tony Blair was saying with regard to this kind of 45 minutes to destruction and stuff, with chemical weapons and all that kind of stuff, right? As soon as we realised there were no WMDs that could hit us in 45 minutes, that's when if the Parliament wanted to, it could have just yanked us out of Iraq, and been like, nope, sorry, you misled us. And then under this system as well, Tony Blair, I'm not even just trying to pick on Tony Blair, but any Prime Minister who brings the country to war, if it later gets found out that it was under false pretenses, we have the power to march our troops straight back out, right? So this kind of gives a lot of power to the Parliament, and also kind of makes it that if we're going to war, let it be for real things, let it be for a good cause and stuff, right? Let's not just send our men and women overseas for just trivial things, and just for just nonsense, basically, right? right, so the next part now, we're going to be looking at the executive. So we've already been speaking about the Prime Minister. So it says here, the Prime Minister is the head of government, and they sit in the Commons and can serve for a maximum of 8 years. So when I looked at this, like, again, in terms of like term limits and stuff, so in America, you've got 8 years. But also when I look at like a Prime Minister we've had, for instance, if you look at like Tony Blair, for instance, he was there for 10 years. If you look at Margaret Thatcher, she was there for 11 years. I think too much power in the hands of too few people for too long is never a good recipe for anyone. And I think like the kind of term limit things, if you're prime minister and you can't get what you need to get done in 8 years, sorry, like work, like do better in it, like kind of like that. That's your business. So my whole take on it is kind of having this kind of maximum of 8 years. I think this is kind of a good thing, right? And we're kind of just laying out what the prime minister is. So already within our own constitution, that like the prime minister by default is this, but I just wanted it to be kind of laid out like this is what the prime minister is, right? They are the leader of the largest party in the Commons and can be removed by a simple majority and a vote of no confidence within the Commons, right? So the prime minister, that's who they are, right? So they're not the person who has control over the majority of the Commons, right? It's the leader of the party which has the most votes, in the Commons. That's who the prime minister is, right? Because under the current system we have at the moment, even with first past the post, you have a system whereby the prime minister is you're gonna end up having hung parliaments and stuff, and by convention the prime minister happens to be whoever can kind of lead that kind of like coalition within that whole hung parliament. However, we want this to be more explicitly said, especially if we end up moving towards proportional representation. We don't want a kind of squabbling thing whereby you got different parties all of different sizes and stuff, and they're all kind of compete and saying, oh, which one of us will be the prime minister? No, the prime minister is the person who's leading the largest party within the Commons. That's just that, right? Now talking about the president, right? So we've mentioned the president within this, but we want to just make this a bit clearer. So the president presides over the Senate and is elected directly by the people through 2 rounds of voting, right? Whereby if the 50% threshold is not met in the first round, the 2 candidates with the most votes will face each other in a runoff election for the second. Now within this system, I kind of originally had the idea of kind of, so in ancient Greece, they would elect people by lot, right? So they would just take a list of people, and basically just essentially the equivalent of like pulling a name out of a hat, right? Now this would be good in some ways because it would stop people from being overly ambitious, because obviously you'd have no way of knowing like whether your name's going to get picked or not, etc., etc. At the same time, that's quite a chaotic system because most people are average, right? And within that, even within our own system here, where we tend to try and pick the best person, we still end up with either mediocre or terrible people. So in this system here, once in a blue moon, you might get someone who's good. A lot of the time you get someone who's average, and sometimes you'd be getting someone who's absolutely terrible and stuff, right? And to have them in the role here, well, as we're going to talk about, for 6 years, that's too long of a time, right? So basically with this system, we're kind of adopting by and large what the kind of like French system is, and other kind of systems where you have a semi-parliamentary system. So you have a prime minister and a president. So that's kind of like what we're kind of trying to do here. The president is limited to serving just 1 6-year term to limit the presidential power and to focus their agenda. So instead of under the US system whereby you have every 4 years, etc., and where the president can serve for 8 years, we didn't want to have that system here. What we wanted instead is an idea which I've thought about for quite some time, right? Which is having one term, a 6-year term, right? And that means that whatever your agenda is within that time, you've got those 6 years to do it. Let's just get it done, right? So this kind of stops people just going on and on and on, right? And it helps them to really be like, right, this is what we want. Now, the president requires at least 5 senators' endorsement, right? So as we say here, is to limit inexperienced populists and to ensure a broad enough support within the Senate across the counties. So within this, it's basically saying that, okay, so 5 senators, this is pretty much the 5% threshold if you've got 96 senators and stuff, right? So the idea of this is we need the endorsement of sitting senators, right? So this means that, for instance, not bad mouthing Trump, right? But Trump might have got picked if it had a similar kind of system. At the same time, there's a chance he might not have been picked because you know, having someone who's a complete outsider but who might just be popular by the people, you don't necessarily want that, right? You don't necessarily want kind of like a demagogue. I'm not necessarily saying like Trump is, but in many regards, like he has some of the hallmarks of that. So you don't necessarily want that, right? So that's why there has to be some levels of checks and balances where like, you know, just like in the French system, whereby a president has to be signed off by like this many people, etc., right? But it's also to ensure that they have like the support of the Senate, because they're going to be sat in the Senate, they're going to be presiding over the Senate. If they can't get along with even like 5 senators within this thing, yeah, right, then it's not good, yeah. And like also like having 5 senators increases the chance it's going to be some like a broad kind of array of the country, right? So it's not going to just be everyone focused on one little, like you might have someone who's very popular within one county, but then they're not popular in the rest of the country, right? So that's kind of something to kind of bear in mind, right? So it said here, in the event of the president's death or impeachment, their vice president will serve out the remainder of their predecessor's term and may run for re-election. So this means that actually you could end up having a president who lasts for slightly longer and stuff, maybe even a maximum of technically slightly shorter than like 12 years and like a absolute kind of crazy thing. But at the same time, it's like, okay, so you've got a vice president and they are serving, and yeah, so under this kind of system here, that kind of ensures that there's a clear kind of line of distinction. So if a president ends up being killed and stuff, we don't have having another election for it. So it's basically just a way of kind of like maintaining that. It also says here that the president may be impeached for an unlawful act and shall be replaced by their vice president. So again, it's kind of like reiterating this thing of like, you know, if they've done something unlawful, they can be removed and they'll be replaced by their vice president. It says here, while the Prime Minister represents the most dominant party in Parliament, the President is more representative of the people, because obviously you're not like elected necessarily who the Prime Minister is. Yeah, people haven't sat down and voted for like, we want this person to be Prime Minister, but for the President, this person's elected by the people, right? So he's representative of the people. So anyway, as I was saying, yeah, right, so the President is more representative of the people and can challenge the policies of the Prime Minister. In the event of the death or removal of the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister shall take over until a new election can take place within the Prime Minister's respective party. So far, for a long time, we haven't had a Prime Minister being killed, right? Or died in office. However, this kind of just lays out a system whereby, okay, Deputy Prime Minister will be the sitting Prime Minister until there's an election within the party, yeah, or whoever the leader will be for the party, and then that person then will become the Prime Minister, right? And also as well, it's saying that in the event of the monarchy ever being abolished, the President would automatically become the official head of state and Commander-in-Chief, although ultimate power would remain with the Prime Minister. So this is basically saying that, you know, if we end up having a republic, right, this clearly ends up, you know, this is what's going to happen. So under the current system, if you go, right, okay, we're not going to have a queen anymore, we're not going to have a king anymore, it's like, well, who kind of takes over their responsibilities? No one, right? So you know, so this kind of lays out that if there is to be a republic, this is how the system would be kind of like sorted out and stuff, right? This is a clear kind of thing of, if this happens, this is what will happen, right? Instead of there being this kind of like debate of like, oh, what will end up happening, right? This leads to uncertainty. This hopefully provides some more certainty. Now, talking here, yeah, we're talking about the role of the president. Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit earlier that like the role of the president is to keep the prime minister in check, right? But I want to kind of like elaborate on that point, right? So here it says the president can only keep check of the power of the prime minister, not overrule them, as the president has no right of veto and may only use their influence within the Senate to persuade the senators to vote a certain way. So I just want to kind of unpack that, yeah, because there's quite a lot with that. So first of all, the president, you know, they can keep the prime minister in check, yeah, but they can't just veto, yeah. So it's not like how you have in like the US system where the president can like veto things. We're not having that kind of system. I think a veto, it gives too much power to one person, and vetoes like in America are very difficult to overturn. You need 2/3 in both houses, and it's just it's too much, right? So the president doesn't have this right to veto. However, the president can use their influence within the Senate, yeah, to persuade the other senators to vote a certain way. And actually, one of the ideas I had, which I've not written explicitly here, but this is kind of what I would prefer, is if the president, you know, much like how the Queen, it doesn't belong to a political party and stuff. Yeah, as much as possible, the president ought to be as neutral as possible. So in an ideal world, I would say that, that the president shouldn't belong to any political party. Yeah, because you want it to be someone who's likable. You want it to be someone who has broad appeal across the different things of the political spectrum. So you don't want like how you have in America, where it's someone who tends to be quite ideological and stuff, or tends to be someone who like really speaks to like their base. You want it to be someone who can kind of represent everyone, yeah, or like at least a super majority of people. So with this kind of thing here, as much as possible, you want someone who's like the Queen, yeah, someone who just doesn't kind of get involved in politics, someone who just only steps in if they absolutely have to and stuff, right? So that's kind of ideally what you want with the president. But obviously, let me know what you think in the comment section with that. Do you want the president to get more involved, or yeah? So that's something to also bear in mind, that if you give the president this kind of highly politicized role, if there ends up being a republic, then you're having a situation whereby, you know, the person who's now replacing like the monarch, they're now a political figure. So you no longer have someone who's like a non-political figure as you would have like with like the king or queen, right? And also as well, when we're talking about here, we're talking about you know, the armed forces must swear their allegiance to the flag, the constitution, and the people, and to defend them against all enemies, be they foreign or domestic. So under the current system, the army, the navy, the Royal Air Force, etc., they swear allegiance to the Queen and to their family, right? Right. So that's kind of problematic, yeah, because it's kind of thing. It's like, okay, yes, the monarch is important and stuff, yeah, but why are they having an oath of allegiance to them personally? And then also as well, what if you're a Republican, yeah, and you want to serve for like the army and stuff, right? And also as well, you see this within Parliament, whereby technically every MP has to swear like an oath, and even if they refuse to swear an oath, the oath is sworn for them by someone. It's kind of technical, it's just stupid, yeah, right. But the thing is, that's something to kind of bear in mind, that like this kind of says, actually, no, the army swears allegiance to the flag, the constitution, and the people, yeah, like it's those things that the army is there to serve. It's not just like, you know, like the commander-in-chief that they're there to serve. It's there to represent like the country and to defend the country, regardless of whether it's like from foreign attacks or from like domestic attacks, right? So that's something to kind of bear in mind. Right, now we're going to talk about the power of the different county governments, right? So, the 48 counties of England are each to have 2 senators to represent them. The 48 counties are the ceremonial counties of England, with the only change being the removal of the City of London from said list, while still retaining its protected status as a separate historic entity, and to create an expanded county in its place, the County of Inner London. So there's a lot of things to unpack with that. First of all, okay, right. So in terms of the different counties, there's so many different ways you can like measure how many counties there are in England. It's kind of like a very like, you know, it's a trick, kind of like a question to have at pubs, because if you look at it in some ways, you could have 83 counties. I've thought that if you had 83 counties, you have 2 senators for each, you're going to having a much larger kind of a legislature. So I think that the 48 counties is kind of big enough, right? So yeah, so 48 counties, and on that list of 48 counties under the current thing, right, you have the City of London. Now, the City of London, yeah, like, you know, the City Mile is just a tiny thing there. And it's kind of just for like business elites and stuff. Almost no one actually like permanently lives there and stuff, right? It operates under its own rules and its own laws and et cetera, et cetera. So what we want to do is want to keep that protected, yeah. Now, the reason for that is because even William the Conqueror, yeah, like in 1066, spoke about like, you know, maintaining the Saxon laws, yeah, of the City of London. So if even, you know, William the Conqueror, yeah, didn't get rid of the City of London, if even the post-war kind of Attlee government, you know, like you know, socialist, like if they didn't get rid of that, then I don't think we should get rid of that. I think for historic reasons, like for cultural reasons, etc., we should maintain the kind of, you know, the kind of separate entity of like a City of London. But out of that, we ought to create like another county, right? So this is the county of Inner London. So the reason for that is, well, we're going to talk about that in the next bit, right? So, you know, so you have the county of Greater London, yeah, will now become the county of Outer London, right? And let's divide the power and population of London between inner and outer London for the sake of the other smaller counties. Now, if you look at like, you know, the gap between how many people live in London compared to like the next largest county, which I think is like is it Birmingham, or I don't know what the exact thing that's called, right? But the thing is, it's like some of the counties in the country have a very large population, and some of them have an absolutely tiny population, right? And so if London is kind of just given its role as its own county, it's going to have too much power. And yeah, you could further divide London up. You could like have like North London, etc. You know, you could have it based on like postcodes and stuff, like you know, northwest, southeast, blah blah blah. But at the same time, that's a different debate for another time. Yeah, I think at bare minimum, I think we need to have an outer London, which, you know, culturally has its own like thing going on, right? And then you inner London, which again culturally and politically has its own thing going on. So that's something to kind of like bear in mind. Yeah, like kind of like, so we want to be a bit more balanced, yeah, with like representation in London. And you know, let me know whether this goes far enough. Yeah, maybe we need to split it based on postcodes. Yeah, like, but that's like neither here nor there, right? And then, you know, the parliamentary boundaries for MPs within each county are to be drawn by a nationwide cross-party committee and not by the counties. So what we're talking about here is to avoid factionalism and corruption through the process of gerrymandering. Now that might sound like a lot of kind of jargon to people here, so we'll kind of break it down. In the US states, right, you have the congressional districts being drawn up by the people within that state. However, it's drawn up by the Republicans and the Democrats, right? So what ends up happening is you're having these crazy lines, right, where things are gerrymandered, yeah? So a district will be drawn based on the fact that they'll be like, okay, we calculate that like people in this district here tend to vote for the Democrats, this district here tends to vote for the Republicans, so we'll draw this here and we'll kind of super imprint like this kind of like super majority, so it's almost impossible for us to ever get kicked out and stuff. Yeah, it's very self-serving, it's very corrupt and stuff, so we don't want gerrymandering. So what we're going to decide is on a nationwide basis, yeah, across parties, and we do mean cross party, like all the smaller parties as well, having a say on how the constituencies will be drawn up, yeah, rather than it just being this kind of tiny elite. Let's have it so it's a bit kind of like more fairly done, right? And now we're talking about the power of the people, right? Power to the people. And actually, sorry, before I even talk about this, yeah, I want to kind of like talk about why even include the rights of the people. Because the US system, it talks about the rights of the states and talks about the rights of, you know, the powers of this place and that. But I wanted to have a section that just devoted to the rights of the people, yeah, within like this system. Because at the time when the founding fathers wrote, you know, the US Constitution, they were very elitist. Only a handful of people could actually vote, so it was written at a time before universal suffrage. So with this system here, I want it to be really focused here on the rights of the people, yeah, and the powers of the people. So anyway, going back to it now. The people vote in elections for their candidates, as well as in referenda on both county and national levels. However, Parliament must strike down any result that violates the human rights of anyone via a vote in both houses of 3/5 or more. So first of all, let's unpack this. So first of all, it's saying that the people have the right to vote in elections and in referendums, right? So that's just that, like kind of on both like a national level and on a county level, right? So you can have referendums in this place and that place, etc., etc. So they end up having, as they call it, the laboratories of democracy, right? So there's competition like at a different level. Some people might want there to be higher taxes, some people might want lower taxes, etc., etc. So there's more of a kind of like federal system here where there's competition, right? Much like how it is in Switzerland in many regards, right? So it's also kind of saying this thing that we said earlier about Parliament has the right to basically strike down any law as unconstitutional. You know, so for instance, if the people ever decide, right, we want to have a referendum on, you know, killing this many people, etc., or taking the rights away from this minority or that minority, etc., the Parliament has to step in and go, that's not happening, right? So the way for that is basically kind of saying, okay, the people have the right to kind of make decisions of, yeah, but at the same time, the Parliament also has the right to kind of like stop them, yeah, if it's too extreme. Obviously, you'll get a lot of politicians who will be thinking about the next election and they will vote against that, you know, they'll vote with the people because they're scared of losing their jobs. But by and large, it still is saying that, you know, Parliament still reserves the right to stop this, right? And the next bit we're talking about, only a future act of Parliament can overturn this decision made by Parliament, right? So this, as we're kind of saying here, this is a defence against the tyranny of the majority, or it's also serving as a defence against the tyranny of an oligarchy. So a lot of people, they might not necessarily understand that. So when you talk about a tyranny majority, this is something that the founders were really opposed to, right? They didn't want there to basically be mob rule, right? They didn't want like 51% of people to be able to vote to take away the rights of the 49%, right? So that's something that this kind of system kind of like upholds, right? So it basically says that, you know, the rights of minorities can't just be overridden by the will of the majority, but also it's also saying that, you know, Parliament, yes, it's an oligarchy. Yeah, yes, there's a tiny elite of people, and yes, they do have some power here. At the same time, they have less power than they do under the current system, whereby Parliament, in theory, and like in reality, in some cases, can just say, "No, this is the law. That's just it. If you don't like it, well, vote us out of office in the next like 5 years, if you even still remember it, or if you even still care." So this is not really you know, this current system that we have is not very democratic. It's not very accountable to people. This like allows it to be much more accountable, but at the same time, it still like retains a lot of the kind of system that we currently have. The next bit here is talking about petitions. Yeah, petitions for referendums. This is the process for how we're going to call a referendum, right? If a petition making up at least 10% of the electorate call for a referendum on any issue, it must be conducted unless it is deemed to be in violation of human rights. So this is what we kind of said before. So the reason I said the 10% figure, and obviously we can have debates on this. Some people might say more, some people might say less, depending on like how much you like people, basically. So in Switzerland, for instance, if 1% of the electorate call for a referendum, it has to be called. Yeah, and I don't, as far as I'm aware, I don't. There might be some other rules attached to it and stuff, but I'm not 100% sure, right? But the thing is, it's like, okay, then you end up just having fatigue, right? So you end up having just constant referendums. You end up, like, if you look at like the list of like referendums that the Swiss have like each year, it's just ridiculous, right? It's just too much. So want to raise the bar a little bit by saying it's 10% of the electorate, but at the same time, if there's a burning issue that the people really want to push through, right, you know, you can get 10% of the electorate to sign a petition. Yeah, it doesn't have to be like a paper petition, it could be online or whatever. So you can have some debates about this, like should it be paper, should it be online. I think it's the modern era, people can do online petitions and stuff. If you can get 10% of the electorate, so bear in mind the electorate at the current time is like 47 million people or something like that. If you can get like, you know, 4.7 million people or whatever it is, yeah, 4.5, 4 million, whatever the actual figure is, right? If you can get 4 million people to sign something, yeah, cool, let's just get the thing done, right? And it's saying here that the next bit, the referenda must be held within a campaign period of between 120 days and 180 days. So we didn't want to be too precise with this, yeah, because obviously there could be all kinds of things, yeah. If you had a pandemic in the middle of this thing, you don't want it to be, you know, too you know, so it had to have a certain level of flexibility. But at the same time, like if you have a referendum, it has to take place within this time. So people have enough time to kind of debate things and to kind of look into it. You don't want to be able to call referendum and next Tuesday you have a vote on it, because people need all the information. They need to have a debate about it. They need to hear all different sides before they make a decision. So you need a long amount of time for people to be consulted, but also at the same time, it can't be something which is kind of kicked in like the long grass by the political class, right? If a referendum is held, there must be no further referenda on the specific matter for a minimum of 10 years. This ensures that enough time is given for implementation and that repeat referenda cannot be constantly called, as well as enough time to reflect and to overturn if necessary. So within this, I've thought about Brexit, right? But also I looked at like the Swiss referendums, right? So in Switzerland, they have like, you know, you can have a referendum on things like again and again and again. Like, you know, in terms of like referendums for Switzerland joining the EU, I think they had one in 1992, they had another one in 1997, and I think they had another one in 2001. Yeah, I may have got some of the figures there wrong, like I got some of the dates there wrong, but like, it's just too much. Yeah, but you can't be asking people time and time again to vote on the same topic. So when we're talking here about like Brexit, for instance, I obviously support Brexit. At the same time, you don't want to have people voting on Brexit every 2 seconds, right? So people kind of call in for a recall of it and stuff, right? It's like, well, actually, not enough time has passed. Yeah, we hadn't even actually implemented Brexit at that time, so you can't just say to people, right, we're gonna go overthrow it, right? But at the same time, there also needs to be a clear kind of thing of like, actually, whether it's the Scottish referendum in 2014 or whether it's the Brexit referendum, you can't say once in a generation, right? You can't say, you know, because that's too long. How do you define a generation? Is that 20 years, like 30 years, 40 years? What is that? Like that's too long. And also, public opinion can change and the political reality and things can change. So people might in one year say we want this, and then as time's gone on, they've kind of gone, actually, we want it to change. If you make it 20 years, it's too long away, right? If you make it 2 years, it's too close, right? So I'm saying 10 years, maybe 8 years, maybe, because I think 10 years is again quite a long time, yeah, right? But I think 10 years is a kind of a benchmark. Let's kind of see what people kind of think on that, right? I don't want to push it lower than 5, and I don't want it to be more than 20, because then that's just kind of ridiculous, right? So let me know what people think on that, what the kind of golden number should be. Should there even be a number? Let me know with that, right? And the next bit here, when we talk about no time limits regarding foreign treaties shall stand, as regardless of parliamentary consent, a simple majority of the people may cancel these at any time. The nation's sovereignty derives not from Parliament, but from the people. So what we're saying with this is regard to foreign treaties, right? Any kind of agreement which ties the nation in, whether it's a free trade deal or kind of join the customs union or whatever it is, right? If the majority of people say we want to get rid of this, it doesn't matter whether we joined it a year ago, it doesn't matter whether we joined it like 2 seconds ago, etc., whatever it is, right? Or not literally 2 seconds ago, whatever, within the setup for here, yeah. If we join a trading bloc, if we join a foreign treaty, and within a year later we don't like it, we the people don't like it, we don't have to wait for another 10 years. Yeah. It's something that Enoch Powell said, yeah, with regard to like the referendum in 1975, yeah, right. And he was asked about like, oh, like, what's your opinion on like having another one? And he was like, well, yeah, of course, because like things can change. So in 1938, as Powell said, yeah, right, if you'd gone to the public then and asked what's your opinion on appeasement, overwhelming majority of people would have been like, yes, Chamberlain's doing a good thing, yeah, let's not go to war. If you'd asked those same people a year later in 1939, after the invasion of Poland, people would have a very different opinion. So you can't have like, a situation where the country is tied in for, from 1938 to 1948, yeah, just because of one referendum. No, foreign policy, things need to move quick, right? So when it comes to foreign treaties, when it comes to any kind of thing like that, the people have a right to yank us out of it, regardless of whether Parliament wants to keep us in, etc., etc. No, sovereignty lies with the people, not with Parliament. And then this final bit with regard to the powers of the people, referenda must be implemented within a period of at least 2 years after said vote. So this is again, if we think about the Brexit vote, so we had Article 50 and stuff. I wanted to like reduce it to less time than this, but like there might be some technical reason, like for different reasons why people go, no, we need more time, whatever. 2 years. I don't care how complicated the thing is, right? If people have voted on something, you've had enough time. I don't like when people kind of go like, oh, Brexit, Brexit was like 5 years ago, right? If people haven't, there was a huge debate. It was a long process and stuff. If you still haven't got things sorted in this time, that's on you, right? Like kind of everyone had enough time to prepare for this. So we don't want a referendum to have to wait like 10 years just to be implemented. We want it to be done as soon as possible. And now this is the final bit, yeah, I promise this is the final bit, and we're talking about the amendments, right? So what I did with this is I looked at the US amendments, and basically was like, okay, a lot of these could just be merged into one. So like this kind of this, yeah. So within this, even if some of these are a bit wordy, they kind of just cover all the different things in like big amendments, yeah. So that's kind of why we've got 9 amendments here. Yeah. So the first one here is talking about freedom of expression, thought, or belief of any kind, provided it does not discriminate due to race, sex, sexuality, disability, or religion, is inviolable, right? So if people want to express an opinion, if people want to say things, if people have a thought, if people have belief, etc., cool. As long as it doesn't discriminate against people, as long as it doesn't, you're saying hate speech, etc. Now, some people might be really opposed to this because they're like, no, like kind of there shouldn't be any hate speech laws. The fact is, the law of the land at the moment is that there's hate speech laws, and while in general I tend to be in favor of freedom of speech, if even at the current time a lot of people are in favor of hate speech laws and stuff, and the younger generation is even more in favor of it, I think to try and the First Amendment within America, I don't think could be passed today, yeah, because like it wouldn't fly and stuff, right? I think so. That's something to kind of like bear in mind and stuff. This still retains people to have the right to say things. It just limits their right to intentionally say like discriminatory kind of things, just for the sake of being provocative and stuff, right? The right to peaceably assemble and to petition the government or the people shall equally not be infringed upon, providing that private property and personal space are not infringed upon in turn, right? So what this is basically saying is, okay, cool. So the people have the right to petition the government or the people, right? So obviously, if you've got referendums and stuff, obviously you've got like elections, like people have a right to peacefully assemble. They've got a right to protest. They've got a right to do all these kind of things here, right? Provided that you don't infringe upon private property. So you can't have you can't storm into someone's living room and start having a protest and stuff. You can't like get up in a politician's face and start screaming in his face and stuff. No, that's not how it works here. Like, you got freedom of speech, you got freedom to express yourself, but at the same time, there also has to be a certain level of respect here, like kind of like, so there has to be some limits to that. There has to be some sort of things like that, right? So this kind of, and also as well, people can't start smashing up property, people can't start rioting, all these kind of things, right? It has to be in a civil way, in a respectful way and stuff, right? So that's kind of what this kind of like laying out, right? So again, let me know what you think about this, but this is something which I think, looking at a lot of protests and being like, actually, a simple thing of just saying, freedom of speech doesn't really, and like freedom of peacefully assemble doesn't, it covers it, but it doesn't really cover it yet. Because just because people aren't throwing Molotovs at you doesn't mean that like it's like okay, right? If someone's like this close to you, they're not personally hurting you, but they're invading your personal space, and it's very uncomfortable, right? Anyway, this next bit here, we'll talk about freedom of choice to elect one's representatives in elections and to vote in referendum, be they local or national, if one is a citizen of England and above the voting age determined by Parliament or the people, shall not be infringed. So basically, I didn't want to say in this thing what the voting age should be, because more likely than not it will change. I personally think it should be 17. I think 18 is slightly too high, like working with young people and stuff, right? 18 might be like slightly too high. 16 I think is too low. I think if you're still doing your GCSEs or whatever, you might understand about politics a little bit, but that's too young for age. I think by 17 people tend to be like a bit more switched on, so I think 17, like kind of like personally, but obviously that's for future like people to decide and stuff. I'm not going to waste time like putting it in thing here just for it to be changed at some later point, because more likely than not, if you say 18, it's going to get changed at a later point, and then someone's got to do more work and put another amendment in. So like we said before, something should remain unwritten with this, something should remain written. I think it's one of those things which just remain unwritten, and that's just a simple vote from Parliament or referendum should decide that. Now this one here is quite a long one, but it just covers a lot of different things. So freedom of access to justice to ensure that one is subject to speedy, fair trials where one is judged by a jury of one's peers, that one's property cannot be searched or seized without a court-ordered warrant, that one's property cannot be sold by the state without just compensation, that one must not be the victim of double jeopardy, that one must not be the victim of excessive bails or fines, that one has the right to not be assaulted whilst in the custody of the authorities, that one must not be subjected to cruel or unusual punishment, that one must not be the victim of slavery or any other involuntary or unconsented physical harm to oneself, that one has the right to an attorney in one's defense, that one has the right to remain silent when questioned so as to protect oneself against self-incrimination. So within that, there's lots of things. It's pretty much like, I think, like the Fifth Amendment of America and the Eighth Amendment pretty much kind of roll into one. The only kind of really new thing in that is basically kind of saying the thing about that one has a right not to be assaulted whilst in the custody of the authorities, i.e. if you're in police custody, if if you're in a prison, if you're in jail, whatever it is, if the police have arrested you in the back of a car, whatever it is, right? If the police are there, the police do not have a right to just assault you and stuff, right? Like, in self-defense, maybe, whatever, okay, but in terms of, if you're in police custody, you shouldn't be getting beaten up, you shouldn't be getting you shouldn't be getting killed and stuff. That's just no, that's not even just like Black Lives Matter, that's just a principle, like who guards the guards, right? That's just that kind of like just fundamental thing. So anyway, so the Fourth Amendment is talking about freedom from martial law, that one cannot be drafted or forced to take part in a war against one's conscience, or to be forced to live under military rule. So this is first of all talking about like kind of like conscription. This is basically saying, actually no, you can't be forced to go to war. Like, you could have conscription in terms of like, working like for the community or whatever it is, etc., etc. I'm personally in favor of something like that. I think that when people turn 18, they should be made to do maybe some basic military training, and then maybe like some other kind of like community kind of like that things for like 3 months or whatever, just over summer, like between like, you know, after you leave sixth form or college or whatever. Yeah, just something. Yeah, but that's a different story for a different time. But certainly no one should be sent to war. Yeah, you shouldn't be asking people to risk their lives for a war that they don't even believe in. That's just a nonsense, and also it doesn't make for very good soldiers, right? And also as well, they're talking here about like you can't put people under martial law. Yeah, like kind of like we're not a country run by generals. We're not a country run by the military and stuff. We're not even like, under no circumstances, no. Like I don't even care if there's a crisis. There's no reason why it should go under military law. You know, like the next bit here, I talk about the Fifth Amendment is laying out the freedom of the county governments to tax and spend at whatever levels, provided that their budgets are balanced over time and that the expenditures reserved for the national government, i.e. defence, foreign policy, border control and upkeep of parliament, remain catered for. So first of all, we're going to just look at that bit, yeah, right? So basically this is allowing, so instead of like in the under like the state system, yeah, whereby like, you know, the federal government like spends a lot, and then yeah, so it's giving the states a lot more freedom, or giving the counties rather a lot more freedom to tax and spend as they want, right? So they can tax as high or as low as they want, but over time their budgets have to be balanced. Now I've said over time rather than saying within the space of a parliament, yeah, because lots of things can happen. There could be a war, there could be a crisis, it could be a situation where it takes, for various different reasons, it takes a long time for the government there to like kind of to balance the budget. So you don't want to have like a hard and fast rule which says that it has to be balanced like now, and it has to always be balanced. So you want it to be a thing where it's like over time, and you want that to be as broad as possible. So if it takes 10 years to balance the budget, it takes 10 years. If it takes 20 years, it takes 20 years, yeah. But, and also as well, some people might vote for more left-wing parties, some people might vote for more right-wing parties. So that's something you have to kind of bear in mind, yeah, right? Kind of that actually, like, you know, I don't like saying left and right. What I mean is like interventionist policies versus like non-interventionist economic policies. So basically Keynes versus Hayek, like that kind of like debate, right, about how involved should the government be. You know, and it's also kind of saying as well that, like, you know, as long as like expenditures are reserved for the national government, yeah. So if the counties are taxing so much that like in time of war the army can't defend the country, you know, and these other kind of things here, yeah, right, then that's like, so the national government, the main thing it should be focusing on is what it cannot allow the county governments to do. So in terms of defence, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of border control, in terms of upkeep of parliament, that's not things that the local governments can do, right? That's something which only the national government can do. So that's something which, like, they need to be able to raise revenue for that. They need to have whatever taxes they need to be able to pay for those services there, and maybe some other ones which I can't think of at the moment, which only they could do, right? And then it says here, to legislate as they see fit the laws which they wish to enact, provided that such laws do not violate the human rights of anyone, the right of secession if a majority in any county seeks it. So we've already said the thing about human rights, so we won't kind of talk about that. But this thing here about the right to secession, if a majority of people in a county want it, right? Now, for me, it's a very fundamental thing. Yes, obviously, the word secession, because of like what happened in America, where like, you know, people seceded for the right to maintain slaves, it's left a kind of bad taste in people's mouths. Do I think that slavery is going to be brought back? No. Like, yeah, this is already covered in like the Third Amendment here. Like, so, and again and again and again, we're talking here about like human rights. So I don't think people are going to secede like in order to oppress people and stuff. If people decide that they want to secede, for instance, if Cornwall wants to secede from England, fine. If the North wants to secede from the South, fine. If inner London, which has a different like political mindset than like the rest of the country, decides that it wants to split away, are we going to be like Spain and sending like the police to like go crack down on people and stuff? No, like, well, this, you know, like it's you know, a nation is like a family and stuff. Yeah, you have to let people have the freedom to come and go if they want. Yeah, like otherwise you don't have a nation, you just have like a prison basically. Yeah, like so different counties within this country have to have the right to leave if they want to. Otherwise, we don't really have a country. We just have a oppressive system. That's not what anyone wants, right? The next bit here, because I've worked with like young people quite a lot, so I really like, this is something which I think is really, really important, right? And some people may agree with this, some people may disagree with it, but talking about the freedom for children to have a right to an education, to be free to choose their own values, beliefs, and identity, to have a right to not be abused in any way by either their peers or by adults, physically, mentally, sexually, or through neglect, to be free to pursue their own career paths and determine their own destinies. Because what I've seen with within like working with young people and just like even just amongst like friends and stuff, right, is parents thinking that they have complete ownership over their children. Yeah, so whether it comes to like, you know, their beliefs and stuff, their identity, like sexual identity, all these kind of things, whatever it is, yeah, right, or even like what careers they do, yeah, like some, you know, the kind of classic kind of like so-called Asian dad, where it's like, no, you have to do this, you have to become a doctor, you have to become an engineer, you have to become this. And it's like, well, no, maybe I want to do this, right? So talking about that and kind of like really emphasizing the rights, you know, like the rights of children to basically determine their own destinies, yeah, to say, no, mum and dad, this is what I want to do. I have a right to do this, yeah. You don't own me, yeah. You may raise me, may have responsibilities for me, but I am my own person. And if I want to identify as this, if I want to like go into like work in it like as this, I have a right to do that and stuff, right? There may in future be some people who, there may be some interpretations of this which people might disagree with. For instance, like the identity thing, you know, kind of 5-year-old just determine whether they want to like change the sex. There might be a debate over that. At the same time, it's a thing where, because everything within this is accountable to public opinion, and also towards like you know, like the courts and like the parliament, etc., etc., it's a thing of, I think that under this system, society is going to move at the pace that society wants it to move at, and I don't think you're going to have anything particularly radical being forced onto anyone, right? Because yeah, like yeah, so even in the current times, like young people already have rights. They are told that even in primary school they have these rights. There may in some instances be ways of this system being abused in some way, so let me know like beforehand, like kind of like, you know, like let me know in the comment section if you think there's any problems with that, or what your opinions on that and what you think should be in its place. Because like I said with this, everything which you disagree with, I want you to say what the alternative is. I'm not just interested in just listening to people just like whinge about things. I want you to say, this is how it should be worded, this is what should stay instead, right? And you know, the next bit is freedom to have the bare necessities of life, yeah. Look for the bare necessity. No, I'm joking. So this is what I'm talking basically about, the you know, the role of government in terms of like the welfare state. Yeah. So regardless of whether you're a free marketeer or whether you're you know, a communist, right? This is kind of saying things which hopefully everyone can kind of agree with. Like, and if they don't agree with it, tough, because like public opinion at any time is going to be in favor of these things. Yeah. So just yeah. So it's saying freedom to have the bare necessities of life, regardless of income, be that access to healthcare, education, an old age pension, legal representation, income support due to lack of employment, income support due to one having a disability, income support due to one having to take care of an infant or heavily dependent person, a decent compensation for paid working hours, a say over who manages one within the workplace, a guarantee of sickness and holiday compensation, protections for one's health and safety within the workplace, and for the reasonable mitigations against pollutants. So within that, that basically covers all kinds of things with regard to like employment laws, and it does add in one other thing, yeah, which is this idea of workplace democracy, which I really am a champion of. I think that whoever manages you, like, you should have a say on who your manager is through a democratic ballot and stuff. However that gets determined within each company. I don't think that, like, if you're a CEO and you're one who founded the company, I don't think that people should ever be able to vote you out and stuff. But if you're, you know, if you're the kind of like CEO of a company which like you got from someone else, etc., etc., you know, the people who you're working under, they should have a say on who you are like, you know, whether they want someone better, you know, etc., etc. And also as well talking about like pay ratios as well. That's a whole different conversation for another day. But I think that these things here are fundamental kind of human rights and stuff. Yes, this is the thing of like your right to work and also your right to still be okay, even if like for whatever reason you can't work, yeah, whether it's old age or disabilities or whatever it is, etc., etc. It's basically ensuring that the state is there to look after you. It doesn't necessarily, people can build on this from as much as they want. Yeah, people could like extend these rights to far bigger things and have some kind of mad socialist kind of thing or whatever. But I think even if you're like some raging kind of like free market libertarian, you're not going to be, you might be opposed to some of these things like a right to healthcare, right to education, etc., etc. The thing is, these things are bare necessities in life, and if you don't support people having the support for these things, eventually you're going to end up having people rise up against the system. Yeah, this is a problem with kind of like the more elitist branches of libertarianism. Like at the end of the day, the people have a voice, yeah, and like poor people have a voice as well. And if people do not have the bare necessities to of life, yeah, right, guess what, they're going to come for them. All right, so this kind of like secures those things there, rather than allowing it to be open for other people to take these rights even further, right? So number 7 is potentially more left leaning. Number 8 is potentially more slightly right leaning, like quote unquote, right? This is freedom from economic mismanagement, right? So be that excessive production of money, peacetime deficits across the lifespan of Parliament, excessive acquisitions of peacetime debts, corruption of the public purse for private gain, excessive campaign contributions, as well as the handing out of the citizenry wealth to foreign governments or individuals without the consent of most of the people. So what this is basically saying is there's lots of things to kind of unpack with this. When it talks about the excessive production of money, this is talking about hyperinflation, yeah, right? So the government cannot just start printing money, yeah, in order to get through out a crisis, because what we've seen time and time again throughout history, regardless of what your like political affiliations is, if the government go and print loads of money, you're going to end up having hyperinflation, and that's going to hurt the poorest people the worst, right? So can't be having that. Peacetime deficits across the lifetime of a parliament. If things are booming, if like there's no war going on, why is the government in deficit, right? Like, at some point you guys need to figure that out. Even if you're like a raging like left wing and stuff, right, you need to be able to raise enough tax revenue to pay for some of these things, even in some of the years. So you might want to do a lot of infrastructure in like the first few years, cool, but then in like the last few years you need to get this sorted. And also as well, I've left it vague as well when it's talking about within the lifetime of a parliament. Is that within the Senate? Is that within the House of Representatives? I.e., is it within the space of 4 years or in the space of 6 years? It's open enough for you guys to be able to kind of like play about with it, and to, you know, also where it talks about excessive acquisition of peacetime debts. If the country is at peace, why are we getting into debt? That's a kind of fundamental question, like kind of like, yeah. So like that's something which kind of, and I've said excessive, so it's vague enough, so there's a debate about what excessive would be defined as. Corruption of the public purse, I think we can all agree with this. If you know, no corrupt officials, right? Again, where it talks about excessive campaign contributions, so yeah, we don't want like billionaires to be able to just bankroll kind of elections, right? So this is a kind of thing where, yes, people can give large donations, but again, people will decide what the definition of excessive in that regard will be, right? As well as the handing out of the citizenry wealth, I don't know what's so difficult for me to say that, yeah, to foreign governments or individuals. So without the consent of most of the people. So within this, it's basically saying, if the government says, right, we're going to give this much money to this country, whether it's foreign aid or whether it's like through like the different like kind of like free trade agreement or whatever it is, right? It's like, okay, cool. As long as a majority of people are in favor of that, then cool. But you can't just be handing out people's money and the people never voted for it. For instance, foreign aid, most people, as far as I'm aware, maybe have changed over the last few years, most people are opposed to it. And especially like some like countries we send it to, and especially in regard to like how that money is spent. So can't be dishing out people's hard-earned tax money to be like bailing out other countries, right? That's not good. If the people don't consent to it, it shouldn't be done, right? So yeah, it still allows of it to be done. It still allows for foreign aid, etc., etc. But the people have to sign on to it. And then the final thing, this is the end of the Constitution, and I'm actually quite tired now, it's gone for quite a long time, is protections of all freedoms not explicitly stated within this document. Basically, this is the same thing as like the Ninth Amendment within the US Constitution. It's basically saying all of the freedoms which we haven't thought of, yeah, and which we haven't explicitly said within this document, guess what? It still is covered, yeah. So even if there's some little thing that we like messed up, and undoubtedly somewhere I've messed up somewhere within here, it still is covered, right? So that being said, let me know in the comment section what things you would want to change about this, what ideas you have, like what alternative things you have basically, yeah. So if you kind of go, right, this line here, it should read as that instead, please that be the case, right? I don't want to just hear people go, no, I don't like this. What would you do it instead, right? And the people who kind of say, oh no, we don't need a constitution, no, just be quiet. Like, no, shut up. Like, kind of like, no, we need a constitution, right? Like the arguments for not having it is it's just, oh, well, everything's all right at the moment. At time of crisis, that doesn't hold water. Also, well, actually, if you're debating about whether there should be an independent England, okay, tell me how long, like, you think the UK, as it currently is, will last. 100 years from the future? 200 years? 300 years? I doubt it, right? So, with all that being said, have a great day, and bye. Oh, and the next video, hold on, sorry, the next video will be on, sorry, I forgot to say, the next video is going to be on when did England become a nation? So after I've read this and stuff, I was having a debate with people online, and people were kind of saying, oh, like nationalism is like a 19th century kind of like creation and stuff. So then I was like, okay, well, what about England, right? So the next video is going to be talking about that. But anyway, have a great day and bye.